They threw her and baby Samuel into the wild boar's den to die like animals in the Oregon wilderness, until Black Wolf, the most feared Modoc warrior in 3 territories, heard her screams and swore an oath that would paint the mountains red. Oregon Territory, September 1872. The Cascade Mountains stretched endlessly toward heaven, their peaks crowned with early snow that caught the morning light like broken glass. Pine forests thick as cathedral walls whispered secrets in languages older than memory. Ancient Douglas firs towered 300 feet into the sky, their trunks so massive that 20 men holding hands could not encircle them. This was land that could break a man's spirit or forge it into something harder than steel, land that had belonged to the Modoc people for countless generations before the first white wagon ever creaked across its sacred ground. It was here, in this wilderness cathedral, that Eleanor Crawford's world would shatter like thin ice beneath a hammer. Eleanor stood beside the covered wagon that had been her home for 6 months, her calloused hands smoothing baby Samuel's cotton blanket against the mountain chill that cut through the clearing like a blade. At 22, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had buried her husband on the trail and kept walking because stopping meant dying. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned in Boston parlor fashion according to the latest ladies' magazines, now hung in practical braids beneath a worn bonnet that had seen better days back in Massachusetts. Samuel, barely 4 months old, and the image of his deceased father with the same deep brown eyes and stubborn chin, slept against her chest, his tiny fist curled around a piece of her faded calico dress. The wagon train had stopped for the night in a clearing that felt wrong in ways Eleanor couldn't quite name. The trees pressed too close, their shadows falling like prison bars across the camp, and the usual evening sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the very wilderness held its breath in anticipation of some coming violence. 18 families had started this journey from Independence, Missouri, 6 months and a lifetime ago, chasing dreams of free land and fresh beginnings in the Oregon Territory, where a man could carve out a homestead and build something lasting. Now only 12 wagons remained, their canvas tops patched and stained, their wooden wheels worn smooth by countless miles of rocky trail. Disease, accidents, and the brutal reality of the westward passage had claimed the rest, leaving graves marked with crude wooden crosses stretching back across half a continent. But it wasn't sickness or mishap that would destroy Eleanor Crawford this night. It was something far more vicious. Human greed dressed up as righteousness, wrapped in biblical quotations and delivered with the fervor of the truly convinced. She had seen it building for weeks, the whispers that followed her like smoke, the way conversation stopped when she approached the communal fire, the sideways glances that measured her worth like livestock at auction. The other women had grown distant since her husband's death from fever outside Fort Laramie, as if widowhood were a disease that might spread through proximity. Jeremiah Blackwood emerged from his wagon like a preacher stepping down from a pulpit to deliver Sunday sermon, his black coat immaculate despite 6 months of trail dust and hardship, his silver hair gleaming in the firelight with the sheen of well-maintained prosperity. At 55, he commanded the wagon train with the authority of a man who believed God spoke directly through his mouth, who saw divine providence in every decision he made and diabolic influence in every voice raised against him. Behind him walked his son Marcus, 28 years old, and built like a bull, with shoulders that could break a man's back and hands that had never known gentleness, his cold blue eyes fixed on Eleanor with the calculating hunger of a predator, sizing up wounded prey. Marcus had been watching Eleanor with increasing boldness since her husband died, making comments about her situation that were supposedly helpful but carried undertones that made her skin crawl. He would appear beside her wagon in the evenings, offering assistance she didn't need, standing too close when he spoke, letting his gaze linger on her body in ways that made her want to wrap herself in every blanket she owned. When she politely declined his help, his face would darken with the frustrated rage of a man unaccustomed to hearing the word no from anyone, especially a woman in desperate circumstances. "Gather round," Jeremiah's voice boomed across the camp, carrying the practiced authority of a circuit preacher who had spent decades bending congregations to his will through the sheer force of his personality. "We need to discuss a matter of grave importance to our Christian community. A decision that will test our faith and our commitment to the principles that guide us on this sacred journey." The families emerged from their evening routines like actors called to take their places on a stage. Fathers setting down tools and weapons, mothers wiping flour from their hands and smoothing their skirts, children peering around fabric barriers with wide eyes that reflected the dancing flames. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach as Jeremiah's gaze fixed on her with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. She knew what was coming. For weeks, she had felt the judgment building like pressure before a storm, had seen the way the other families looked at her during their evening prayers, had heard her name whispered in tones usually reserved for discussing moral failings and divine punishment. Only Martha Henley, a kindly woman from Ohio with gentle eyes and work-worn hands, still spoke to her with genuine warmth, still included her in conversations about children and cooking and the small domestic details that made life bearable on the trail. "Eleanor Crawford," Jeremiah began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment, each word falling like stones into still water. "You stand before us as a burden this train can no longer bear. A woman alone with a child, consuming resources meant for families who contribute to our collective welfare and survival. You have no husband to hunt game for the common pot, no man to drive your wagon when the trail grows treacherous, no provider to ensure your survival through the harsh Oregon winter that awaits us." His words created ripples of uncomfortable silence that spread through the gathered families like a disease. Eleanor's hands tightened around Samuel as the baby stirred against her chest, sensing the tension in her body even in his sleep. "I pull my weight," she said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice water in her veins. "I cook for the sick. I tend wounds and deliver babies. I help with births and burials and all the tasks that keep this community together. I wash clothes and mend tears and take my turn at watch duty. I ask for nothing more than any other family takes from our common stores." But even as she spoke, she could see the decision had already been made in the hard lines of Jeremiah's face and the satisfied gleam in Marcus's eyes. This wasn't a discussion or a negotiation. It was a sentencing disguised as democracy. Marcus Blackwood stepped forward, his bulk casting Eleanor in shadow as the firelight played across his scarred knuckles and cruel mouth. "My father offers you a solution," he said, his voice thick, with false kindness that fooled no one, least of all Eleanor. "Marry me, become my wife, and your troubles end like morning mist in sunlight. You and the boy will have protection, provision, a place in this community that no one can question or challenge." His eyes traveled down her body with an ownership she found repulsive, taking inventory of what he considered his rightful property. "I'm a patient man, understanding of your situation. I can overlook your previous circumstances and the unfortunate timing of your condition." The offer hung in the air like the smell of carrion attracting vultures. Eleanor had seen how Marcus treated his animals, had watched him beat his oxen bloody when they stumbled from exhaustion, had heard the stories whispered by the other women about his first wife, Sarah, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Back in Illinois, the official story was a fall down cellar stairs, but the women knew better, had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes during their brief marriage, had noticed how she flinched when Marcus raised his voice or moved too quickly in her direction. The thought of his hands on her, of Samuel growing up under his influence, learning that violence was the natural order of things, made her physically ill. "I decline your generous offer," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent camp with the clarity of a church bell on Sunday morning. "I'll make my own way in this world, whatever the consequences might be." The words were brave, spoken with more confidence than she felt, but she knew they sealed her fate as surely, as if she had signed her own death warrant. Jeremiah's face darkened like a storm cloud, gathering strength on the horizon. "Then you condemn yourself and that innocent child," Jeremiah thundered, his preacher's voice echoing off the mountain walls and sending startled birds fleeing from their roosts in the towering pines. "We cannot spare food for those who contribute, nothing but additional mouths to feed. We cannot slow our pace for those who cannot keep up when winter approaches, and every day of delay means death in the mountain passes. You have made your choice, and now you must live with the consequences of your pride and stubbornness." He turned to address the rest of the camp, his voice rising to pulpit volume. "This woman has rejected Christian charity and chosen false pride over humble submission to God's plan. She's no longer part of our community or under our protection." The families shifted uncomfortably on their makeshift seats of wagon tongues and supply crates, but none spoke in Eleanor's defense. Fear ruled the trail stronger than conscience or Christian charity. They needed Jeremiah's leadership to reach Oregon alive, needed his knowledge of the trails and his connections with the military forts that provided safe harbor along the route. Crossing him meant risking their own family's survival, and survival trumped sentiment every time on the frontier. Eleanor understood their silence, even as it broke her heart, understood the terrible arithmetic of life and death that governed every decision on the westward trail. Martha Henley stepped forward, her weathered face creased with distress and moral conflict. Her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles showed white in the firelight. "Jeremiah, please reconsider this harsh judgment. The woman has done nothing wrong that I can see. She's helped birth 3 babies on this train, nursed the sick through the cholera outbreak that claimed 6 lives, sat vigil with the dying when their own families were too afraid of contagion to come close. Her husband grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back into the safety of anonymity, but Martha shook him off with surprising strength. Surely we can find room for Christian mercy in our hearts." "Mercy?" Jeremiah's laugh was cold as winter. Wind howling through mountain passes, sharp as the crack of breaking ice. Mercy is what led Eve to temptation in the garden, what brought sin and death into God's perfect world. This woman brings discord to our community with her very presence. Her refusal to accept proper feminine submission reminds us of death and failure and the chaos that follows when natural order is disturbed. His eyes gleamed with the fervor of the truly convinced, the absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his own righteousness. God has spoken through her husband's death, marked her for suffering as surely as he marked Cain for murder. Marcus smiled, the expression making his face even uglier and more threatening than usual. "Last chance, Eleanor. Marriage or the wilderness, protection or predators. Choose wisely, because there won't be another opportunity for salvation." His hand rested on the pistol at his hip, the threat unmistakable as thunder before lightning. Around the camp, other men fingered their weapons, ready to enforce whatever decision their leader made, regardless of their personal feelings about the justice of it. Eleanor looked around the circle of faces that had once been friendly, searching desperately for any sign of support or compassion. She found only averted eyes and pursed lips, the careful neutrality of people who had chosen their own survival over moral courage. These people, who had shared meals and stories around countless campfires, who had prayed together over freshly, dug graves and celebrated together at river crossings, who had helped each other through sickness and accidents and the thousand small crises of trail life, now watched her destruction with the detached interest of spectators at a public hanging. "Then I choose the wilderness," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger with each word as anger began to burn away fear. "I choose freedom over slavery, dignity over degradation, honest poverty over dishonest prosperity. If this is what your Christianity looks like, if this is how you practice the charity and mercy you preach about on Sunday mornings, then I want no part of it or you." Samuel began to cry, as if sensing the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a thunderstorm. Jeremiah's face twisted with rage at her defiance, at her refusal to submit to his authority and accept the fate he had chosen for her. "So be it, you stubborn woman. Pack your belongings and prepare to face the judgment of the wilderness. You have until dawn to leave our camp and our protection. Take nothing that belongs to the community, no food we have shared, no water. From our barrels, no tools or weapons we have provided for common defense." He turned his back on her with theatrical finality, and one by one, the other families did the same, returning to their wagons and their evening routines as if nothing momentous had just occurred. Eleanor spent the night packing her few possessions, by moonlight that filtered through the pine branches like silver lace. A change of clothes for herself and Samuel, her husband's leather-bound Bible with its gilt-edged pages and familiar passages underlined in fading ink, a small sewing kit with needles and thread, a tin cup that had belonged to her grandmother, and the gold locket her mother had given her on her wedding day, the only jewelry she owned and her last connection to the civilized world she was leaving behind. Everything else, the wagon that had been her home, the oxen that had pulled it across half a continent, the stores of food and supplies she had helped gather and guard, all of it was declared community property, seized by men who spoke of Christian charity while practicing naked theft. Martha Henley approached as Eleanor prepared to leave, moving like a shadow through the sleeping camp to avoid detection by her husband or the other families. She pressed a small bundle into Eleanor's hands, her own trembling with emotion and fear. "Hardtack and jerky," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "It's not much, but it's what I can spare without my husband noticing. The loss. God forgive us all for what we're doing to you and that innocent baby." Tears streamed down her lined face as she hurried back to her wagon, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost seeking absolution for sins she couldn't prevent. Dawn came cold and grey, mist rising from the forest floor like the spirits of the damned seeking redemption in the pale morning light. Eleanor stood at the edge of camp with Samuel in her arms, wearing every piece of clothing she owned against the mountain chill that cut through fabric like it was made of paper. Her small bundle of possessions felt pathetically light across her shoulders, everything she owned in the world reduced to what one woman could carry while holding a baby. "Move along now," Marcus called out, his voice cheerful as if he were bidding farewell to invited guests, rather than condemning a woman and child to almost certain death. "Daylight's burning, and we've got miles to make before we reach the next water source. Oregon won't wait for stragglers." The wagon train began its preparations for departure, the familiar morning sounds of harnesses jingling and wheels creaking, filling the mountain air with their mechanical symphony. Eleanor walked into the forest without looking back, following a narrow game trail that led deeper into the mountains and away from everything she had ever known. Behind her, she could hear the wagon train rolling away, taking with it the last remnant of the civilized world and leaving her alone in a wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Ahead lay only uncertainty, the growing certainty that she and Samuel would die alone among the towering pines, and the slim hope that death might come quickly when it finally arrived. For 3 days she walked deeper into the mountains, rationing Martha's meager gift of food down to crumbs, drinking from mountain streams that ran ice-cold even in late summer, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find among the roots of fallen. giants or in shallow caves carved by wind and water over countless centuries. Samuel grew weaker with each passing hour, his cries becoming fainter as Eleanor's milk dried up from stress and starvation and the constant fear that gnawed at her. Like a living thing, on the fourth morning, she could barely stand, her legs shaking like a newborn colt's as she tried to force herself upright. It was then she heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares for whatever time she had left. The low, rumbling grunt of wild boars somewhere ahead on the trail, their voices carrying through the forest like the growls of demons. Through the trees, she glimpsed their massive shapes rooting through the undergrowth with single-minded intensity, their curved tusks gleaming like ivory daggers in the dappled sunlight. There had to be at least 6 of them, maybe more, each one weighing as much as a full-grown man and armed with weapons that could gut a horse. Eleanor tried to retreat, to back away slowly and find another path through the wilderness. But her weakened legs betrayed her when she needed them most. She stumbled over a fallen log, crying out involuntarily as she fell hard on the rocky ground. The sound echoed through the forest, like a dinner bell announcing fresh meat. 6 pairs of red eyes turned toward her with the focused attention of born killers, and the largest boar, a massive sow with scars covering her snout like battle honors, began to advance with the deliberate pace of a creature that knew its prey had nowhere to run. What happened next would be burned into Eleanor's memory forever, assuming she lived long enough to have memories. The sow charged with a speed that defied her bulk, and Eleanor scrambled backward on hands and knees until her shoulders hit the rock wall of what she now realized was a shallow cave, the boar's den. She had stumbled directly into their home with her baby in her arms, like a lamb walking into a wolf's lair. The sow stopped just outside the cave entrance, her massive head swaying as she tested the air for the scent of fear and weakness. The other boars gathered behind her in a semicircle, their grunts and snorts creating a symphony of menace that seemed to come from the earth itself. Eleanor pressed herself against the back wall of the cave. Samuel clutched against her chest, both of them trapped with no escape route and no hope of rescue. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The boars settled in to wait with the patience of natural predators, knowing their prey had nowhere to run and all the time in the world to savor their victory. Eleanor's water was gone, her food exhausted. Samuel's weak cries echoed off the cave walls, growing fainter with each passing hour, as his small body began to shut down from hunger and exposure. As night fell over the mountains, Eleanor realized with crystal clarity that this cave would be their tomb, and no one would ever know what became of the woman and child who had dared to choose freedom over submission. She thought of Marcus Blackwood's leering face, of Jeremiah's righteous condemnation, of the families who had watched her exile without protest or intervention. They had thrown her and her innocent child to the wolves as surely as if they had carried them here themselves and left them as an offering to the wilderness. In their eyes, she and Samuel were already dead, already forgotten, already replaced by more compliant souls who wouldn't challenge the natural order of things. But Eleanor Crawford was not ready to die. Not yet. Not like this. Not without someone knowing the truth about what had been done to her. She began to scream, her voice carrying through the mountain air like the cry of a banshee calling down curses on the living, telling her story to the forest, to the sky, to whatever gods might be listening in the vast emptiness above. She screamed until her throat was raw and bleeding, until Samuel joined his weak voice to hers, until the very mountains seemed to echo with their defiance and their refusal to die quietly. And in the darkness beyond the boars, something heard. Them. Something that moved through the forest like a shadow, given form and purpose, something that had been watching the white settlers with growing anger for months as they despoiled sacred ground and left their poison wherever they passed. Something that understood betrayal and abandonment better than most, and had sworn long ago that such cruelty would not go unanswered by those with the power to seek justice. Black Wolf had been tracking the wagon train for weeks, watching their progress through Modoc territory with the patience of a born hunter and the anger of a man who had seen too much suffering. He had seen them dump their sick by the roadside like garbage, had watched them abandon broken wagons and dying animals without a second thought, had witnessed their casual cruelty to everything that wasn't useful to their relentless westward march. But this was different. This was a woman and child thrown away like refuse, left to die for the crime of refusing to submit to masculine authority. The war paint on his face caught the moonlight as he stepped into the clearing, red and black stripes that marked him as a warrior of the Bear clan, earned through deeds that had made his name feared from the Columbia River to the California border. In his hand, a bone knife gleamed white as starlight and sharp as winter ice. At his side, a tomahawk waited for blood, its steel head polished to a mirror shine, and its handle wrapped in leather from his first kill. Black Wolf had earned his name and his fearsome reputation across 3 territories, but tonight he would add a new chapter to the legend that mothers used to frighten disobedient children. He looked toward the cave, where Eleanor's screams had finally faded to whispers, where a woman and child waited for death in the darkness while their killers watched with animal patience. His voice, when it came, was soft as falling snow and hard as winter iron, carrying the weight of an oath sworn before the spirits of his ancestors. "Blood will pay for this," he said to the night sky, his words echoing off the mountain walls. Like thunder before the storm, Black Wolf moved through the darkness like death itself, his moccasined feet making no sound on the forest floor as he approached the boar's den, where the woman's cries had finally fallen silent. The war paint on his face told a story written in blood and ash, red stripes for the enemies he had killed, black for the mourning that never left his heart, white dots for the spirits of his fallen brothers who guided his path through this world of endless violence. At 35, he had already lived 3 lifetimes by white man's measure, each one ending in tragedy and beginning again in vengeance. The Boars sensed his presence before they saw him, their primitive brains recognizing a predator more dangerous than themselves. The massive sow lifted her scarred snout, testing the air for a scent that spoke of something beyond their understanding. Not prey, not rival, but something that hunted hunters and turned killers into victims. Her grunt of unease rippled through the pack, causing the younger boars to shift nervously, their red eyes reflecting moonlight like drops of fresh blood. Black Wolf had no fear of the wild pigs that terrorized white settlers and sent grown men scrambling up trees like frightened children. He had fought grizzly bears with nothing but a knife and his bare hands, had tracked mountain lions through blizzards that would kill lesser men, had survived winters in the high country that turned rivers to stone and breath to ice crystals. These tusked swine were dangerous to farmers and townspeople, but to a Modoc warrior raised in the old ways, they were merely another obstacle to overcome. He drew his bone knife, its edge honed to surgical sharpness on whetstones carried from the sacred caves where his grandfather had taught him the warrior's path. The blade was carved from the thigh bone of the first elk he had killed as a boy, blessed by the medicine men and stained with the blood of more enemies than he could count. In his other hand, his tomahawk sang through the air with a sound like wind through pine branches, its steel head catching starlight as it spun in perfect balance. The attack came with the sudden violence of a lightning strike. Black Wolf exploded from the tree line in complete silence, his war cry erupting only when the bone knife found its mark between the lead sow's ribs, sliding between cartilage and muscle to pierce her heart with surgical precision. The massive animal dropped without a sound, her life ending before her brain could process the attack. The other boars scattered in panic, their primitive courage evaporating in the face of something they couldn't understand or fight. Within moments, the clearing was empty, except for the dead sow and the warrior who had killed her. Black Wolf wiped his blade clean on the animal's coarse hide, then turned his attention to the cave, where he could hear the faint whimpering of an infant and the ragged breathing of a woman pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. He approached slowly, knowing that white people shot first and asked questions later, especially when confronted by a painted warrior in the middle of the wilderness. "Woman," he called softly in English, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as someone who had learned the white man's tongue from traders and soldiers rather than in mission schools. "The pigs are gone. You can come out." His words echoed off the cave walls, mixing with the sound of Eleanor's labored breathing and Samuel's weak cries. He could smell their fear, sharp and acid in the mountain air, underlaid with the scent of approaching death. Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the cave, certain that one nightmare had simply been replaced by another. She had heard the stories around campfires, tales of savage Indians who tortured captives for days before allowing them to die, who took white women as slaves and raised their children as heathens. The war paint visible in the moonlight confirmed her worst fears. She had escaped the Boars only to fall into the hands of something far worse. "Please," she whispered, her voice broken by days of screaming and thirst. "Take me if you must, but spare the baby. He's done nothing wrong. He doesn't deserve to suffer for my choices." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel's cries grew weaker in her arms, his small body burning with fever as starvation and exposure took their inevitable toll. She could feel his life slipping away with each labored breath, and the knowledge that she had failed to protect him cut deeper than any physical wound. Black Wolf heard the resignation in her voice, the acceptance of a fate she considered worse than death. It was a sound he knew well, the same tone his sister had used when the cavalry soldiers dragged her from their burning village, the same broken whisper that had escaped his mother's lips as she bled to death in the ruins of their winter lodge. White people always assumed the worst about his kind, never considering that mercy might exist in red hearts as surely as cruelty lived in white ones. "I do not make war on women and children," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Your people threw you away like garbage. Mine do not abandon the helpless." He moved closer to the cave entrance, allowing the moonlight to illuminate his face so she could see that he meant no immediate harm. The war paint made him appear demonic in the shifting shadows, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen in days: compassion. Eleanor studied his face, searching for deception or hidden violence. What she found instead was a man who looked as tired as she felt, whose eyes held the same kind of pain that had been her constant companion since her husband's death. There were lines around those eyes that spoke of suffering beyond her understanding, scars that told stories of battles fought not for conquest, but for survival. This was not the savage monster of campfire tales, but something far more dangerous, a human being with his own reasons for anger. "Why?" she asked, the single word containing all her confusion and desperation. "Why help us? Your people and mine are enemies. We've taken your land, killed your families. What do you gain by saving us?" Samuel's breathing grew more labored in her arms, and she knew that whatever this warrior's intentions, her son was running out of time. Black Wolf considered her question, weighing truth against the easier comfort of lies. "My sister had a baby," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "White soldiers came to our village during the winter, said we were harboring hostiles. They burned everything, killed everyone who couldn't run fast enough. She tried to protect her child, tried to shield him with her body." He paused, the memory cutting through him like a blade made of ice and regret. Eleanor saw the pain flicker across his features, a momentary crack in the warrior's mask that revealed the man beneath. "What happened to them?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. "They died in the snow," Black Wolf said simply. "Both of them. The baby first, then my sister from grief and cold. I found them 3 days later, frozen together like they were sleeping." His voice remained steady, but Eleanor could hear the rage underneath, carefully controlled, but always present. "The soldiers called it justice, said they were eliminating threats to white civilization." The parallel was not lost on Eleanor. A woman and child abandoned to die by people who claimed moral authority, left to perish because they were inconvenient or unwanted. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Not all of us are like that. Some of us just want to build a life, raise our children in peace." But even as she spoke, she remembered the faces around the campfire, the silence that had greeted her exile, and wondered if she was lying to them both. Black Wolf knelt at the cave entrance, close enough now that she could see the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt, the eagle feathers woven into his long black hair, the sacred symbols painted on his chest that marked him as a man of standing among his people. "Your child is sick," he observed, his trained eye taking in Samuel's labored breathing and flushed skin. "How long since he last ate?" Eleanor's throat closed with emotion as she realized how close to death her son had come. 2 days, maybe 3. My milk dried up when the fear got too bad. I've had nothing to give him." The admission felt like confessing to murder, acknowledging her failure as a mother to provide the most basic necessity of life. Without a word, Black Wolf turned and walked back to the dead sow, drawing his knife to cut away choice pieces of meat. Eleanor watched in fascination as he built a small fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had lived his entire life in the wilderness, using flint and steel to coax flames from tinder dry as bone. The smell of cooking meat filled the clearing, making her stomach clench with desperate hunger. "Broth," he said, returning to the cave with a strip of meat simmering in a makeshift pot fashioned from birch bark. "For the baby first, then food. For you, strength returns slowly, but it returns." He offered her the container, his scarred hands steady despite the violence they had recently committed. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, old prejudices warring with desperate need, before accepting the gift that might save her son's life. Samuel took the warm broth eagerly, his small throat working to swallow the life-giving liquid. Color returned to his pale cheeks almost immediately, and his breathing began to ease as nourishment reached his starving body. Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she watched her son respond to the simple mercy of food and warmth. Black Wolf watched the reunion between mother and child with something approaching satisfaction. In his culture, children were sacred gifts from the spirit world, precious beyond any material wealth. The white man's willingness to abandon their young never ceased to amaze and disgust him. "What did you do?" he asked, as Eleanor fed Samuel another spoonful of broth. "What crime earned you this punishment?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I refused to marry a man who would have beaten me and corrupted my son. I chose poverty and freedom over comfort and slavery. In their eyes, that made me worse than a criminal. It made me an ungrateful woman who didn't know her place." The bitterness in her voice could have corroded metal. Years of suppressed anger finally finding expression. The warrior nodded as if this confirmed something he had long suspected about white society. "Among my people, a woman who shows such courage would be honored, not punished. Marriage is a choice, not a sentence. Children belong to the whole tribe, not to whoever claims ownership of their mother." He fed the fire with careful precision, ensuring the flames would burn hot without creating smoke that might attract unwanted attention. Eleanor studied his profile in the firelight, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes and the careful way he chose his words. This was not the savage portrayed in newspaper accounts and dime novels, but an educated man who spoke multiple languages and understood complex social concepts. "You know our language well," she observed. "Where did you learn to speak English so clearly?" A shadow crossed Black Wolf's features. "Catholic mission school," he said with obvious distaste. "My father thought learning white ways would help. Our people survived what was coming. The priests tried to beat the Indian out of us, make us ashamed of our heritage and grateful for their salvation." His laugh was harsh as winter wind. "They succeeded better than they knew. I learned your language, your customs, your weaknesses, knowledge I use now to protect what little remains of my world." Eleanor heard the pain beneath his words and recognized a kindred spirit. Someone else who had been shaped by loss and betrayal, who had learned that survival sometimes required becoming something harder than you ever intended to be. "What will you do with us?" she asked, voicing the question that had been growing in her mind as Samuel grew stronger and more alert in her arms. Black Wolf considered the question while turning meat over the fire, the fat hissing and popping in the flames. "The nearest white settlement is 4 days' walk south, assuming you can travel. But they will ask questions, demand explanations. Your own people cast you out. What welcome will you find among strangers?" His words forced Eleanor to confront a reality she had been avoiding. Even if they reached civilization, she would still be a woman alone with a child and no resources. "Then what do you suggest?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Where can someone like me go when her own kind have rejected her?" The firelight played across her face, highlighting the exhaustion and desperation that had become her constant. "Companions." Black Wolf was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeking guidance from the spirits that lived in fire and smoke. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change all their lives. "My people have a winter camp in the high country, hidden in places your soldiers have never found. We take in refugees sometimes, escaped slaves, outcasts, those with nowhere else to turn." He met her eyes across the fire. "You could come with me." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Eleanor felt her heart race as she considered the implications. To leave the white world entirely, to raise Samuel among people who would see him as something other than a bastard child. To find sanctuary in the very culture her own people considered savage and uncivilized. It would mean abandoning everything she had ever known about herself and her place in the world. "What would be expected of me?" she asked carefully. "I won't be anyone's slave or concubine, no matter how desperate my situation becomes. I've already proven I'd rather die than submit to that kind of arrangement." Her voice carried the steel that had sustained her through exile and abandonment. Black Wolf's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been in a world without war and hatred. "You would be a guest, under the protection of my clan. You would work as everyone works, contribute as you can, learn our ways if you choose. No one would force marriage or anything else upon you. Among my people, a woman's body belongs to herself alone." Eleanor felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope, not the desperate clawing hope of a drowning person grasping at driftwood, but the genuine possibility that she and Samuel might not only survive, but thrive. The idea of raising her son in a culture that valued courage over submission, that honored women who stood firm in their convictions rather than punishing them for independence, was almost too wonderful to believe. Samuel stirred in her arms, his eyes opening to focus on the firelight with the alert attention of a child whose strength was returning. For the first time in days, he seemed truly awake, truly present in the world. Eleanor took this as a sign, a message from whatever benevolent forces might still watch over the innocent and abandoned. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger than she had intended. "Yes, we'll come with you. Whatever awaits us in your winter camp has to be better than what we've left behind." As she spoke, she felt the last ties to her former life snap like dried reeds in a strong wind. Black Wolf nodded solemnly, understanding the magnitude of the choice she had made. "We leave at first light," he said, already planning the route that would take them deep into Modoc territory where white law could not follow. "The journey will be hard, but my people will welcome you. They understand what it means to be cast out by those who should have protected you." As Eleanor settled Samuel against her chest and prepared to sleep beside the fire that had saved their lives, she thought about the strange path that had led her to this moment. 12 hours ago, she had been preparing to die in a cave surrounded by wild animals. Now she was about to begin a new life among people her culture had taught her to fear, guided by a warrior who had shown her more kindness than her own kind ever had. Black Wolf maintained watch through the night, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats while his mind wrestled with the decision he had made. Taking white refugees to the winter camp was dangerous. It could expose his people to discovery, bring down the wrath of the cavalry on the hidden village where women and children sought shelter from an increasingly hostile world. But some choices transcended tactical considerations, reached into the realm of honor and conscience, where warriors found the courage to do what was right rather than what was safe. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor woke to find Black Wolf preparing for travel with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything. Samuel was stronger after a night of warmth and nourishment, his eyes bright and curious as he took in his surroundings. For the first time since leaving the wagon train, Eleanor allowed herself to believe they might actually survive. The warrior helped her to her feet, his touch gentle but impersonal, carefully respectful of boundaries that mattered even in desperate circumstances. "Ready?" he asked, shouldering a pack that contained everything they would need for the 4-day journey into the heart of Modoc territory. Eleanor looked back once at the cave that had nearly become their tomb, then turned toward the mountains that would either offer salvation or present new dangers. "Ready," she said, and meant it. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the civilized cruelty they were leaving behind. The journey into Modoc territory began before sunrise, when the mountain air cut like broken glass and frost painted the pine needles silver in the pale light. Black Wolf moved with the fluid grace of someone born to the wilderness, his moccasined feet finding purchase on rocks that would have sent a white man tumbling into the ravines below. Eleanor followed behind him, Samuel strapped to her chest with strips of leather the warrior had fashioned from his own clothing, her city-bred legs trembling with exhaustion after only an hour of climbing. The trail Black Wolf chose existed only in his memory and the memory of his ancestors, invisible to white eyes but clear as a marked road to someone raised in the old ways. They climbed through stands of ancient Douglas fir that had weathered centuries of storms, their massive trunks scarred by lightning and marked with symbols that told stories in a language Eleanor was only beginning to understand. Eagles circled overhead, their cries echoing off canyon walls like the voices of spirits announcing the passage of travelers through sacred ground. By midday, they had climbed above the tree line into a realm of naked stone and endless sky, where the air grew thin enough to make Eleanor's lungs burn with each breath. Black Wolf called a halt beside a natural spring that bubbled up from cracks in the granite, its water so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. Eleanor collapsed gratefully onto a sun-warmed boulder, her legs shaking from exertion and her head swimming from the altitude. "Drink slowly," Black Wolf warned, as she bent toward the spring with desperate thirst. Mountain water is different from the flat water you know. Too much too fast will make you sick. He demonstrated the proper technique, cupping his hands to take small sips while offering thanks to the water spirits in words that sounded like, "Wind through stone caves." Eleanor followed his example, feeling the cold mountain water revive her parched throat and clear her head of the fog that had been building since they began their ascent. Samuel stirred against her chest, his small face scrunched with the effort of adapting to the thin air, but his breathing remained steady and strong. The warrior had been right about the healing power of food and rest. Her son was proving more resilient than she had dared to hope. "How much farther?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the exhaustion from her voice. She had been walking for 6 hours through terrain that challenged her every step, and her body was approaching the limits of endurance. The muscles in her legs felt like molten lead, and blisters were forming inside her worn leather shoes. Black Wolf studied the position of the sun and the lay of the land ahead with the practiced eye of someone who navigated by natural landmarks rather than maps and compasses. "Half a day more," he said, his tone neither encouraging nor discouraging, but simply factual. "The hardest part comes next, a passage through the rock maze that guards the approach to our hidden valley. Many have tried to find it. None have succeeded without a guide." Eleanor nodded, accepting the necessity of pushing herself beyond what she thought possible. The alternative was to turn back toward the world that had cast her out, to face the slow death of poverty and rejection among people who considered her existence an affront to their moral order. Better to risk death in these mountains than to accept slow degradation in the towns below. As they resumed their climb, Black Wolf began to share fragments of knowledge that would help Eleanor understand the world she was entering. He pointed out the tracks of mountain goats on impossible ledges, explained how his people read weather patterns in the behavior of birds, identified plants that could heal wounds or ease the pain of childbirth. Each lesson was delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone, as if he were discussing the time of day rather than revealing secrets that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. "Your people think the mountains are empty," he said, as they negotiated a narrow ledge that dropped away into nothingness on one side. "They see rocks and trees, dangers to overcome on the way to somewhere else. They never learn to listen to what the land is telling them, never understand that every stone and stream has a voice for those who know how to hear it." His words carried the weight of generations of accumulated wisdom. Eleanor found herself listening with new ears to the symphony of sounds around them, the whisper of wind through granite formations, the distant cry of a hawk hunting in the valley below, the subtle shift in the mountain's breathing that announced changes in weather. Still hours away, for the first time in her life, she began to understand that the wilderness was not empty space waiting to be filled by civilization, but a complex living system with its own intelligence and purpose. The rock maze Black Wolf had mentioned. It proved to be a labyrinth of narrow canyons and towering stone pillars that rose from the mountainside like the ruins of some ancient cathedral. The passages between them twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that would confuse even the most experienced tracker. Eleanor quickly lost all sense of direction as they wound deeper into the maze, following paths that seemed to lead nowhere before suddenly opening onto new vistas. "Spanish conquistadors came this way 200 years ago," Black Wolf explained, as they paused at a junction where 5 different passages offered potential routes forward. They had native guides, detailed maps, dozens of men on horseback. They wandered in this maze for 3 days before giving up and turning back. "The Modoc have used these rocks as protection for centuries, long before white men ever saw this country. Eleanor could understand why the maze had defeated previous expeditions. The passages all looked identical to her untrained eye, winding through corridors of red sandstone that seemed to shift and change with the moving shadows. Without Black Wolf's guidance, she would have been hopelessly lost within minutes, wandering in circles until thirst or exposure claimed her life. The warrior moved through the maze with the confidence of someone following a familiar path home, his steps never hesitating as he chose between passages that all looked equally promising or equally treacherous. Occasionally he would stop to examine marks carved into the stone, symbols that looked like random scratches to Eleanor, but clearly carried meaning for those who knew how to read them. Trail markers, he explained when she asked about the carvings. They tell us which paths are safe, which lead to dead ends, which routes to take in different seasons when snow changes the landscape. My grandfather carved some of these when he was a young man learning the warrior's path. Now I maintain them for the next generation. Eleanor began to appreciate the incredible depth of knowledge required to survive in this environment. The countless generations of accumulated wisdom encoded in every aspect of Modoc culture. These were not the savages portrayed in newspaper accounts, but a sophisticated people who had developed complex systems for thriving in one of the most challenging environments on the continent. As they emerged from the final passage of the maze, Eleanor gasped at the sight that greeted her. Before them lay a hidden valley that seemed to exist outside the normal world, a pocket of paradise concealed within the harsh mountain landscape. Grass meadows stretched between groves of aspen and pine, fed by streams that cascaded down from surrounding peaks in silver ribbons. The air here was warmer and more gentle, protected from the harsh winds that scoured the exposed ridges. But it was the village itself that took Eleanor's breath away. Unlike the rough log cabins and hastily erected structures of white settlements, the Modoc winter camp showed the aesthetic sensibility of a people who had learned to live in harmony with their environment. Traditional Thule lodges blended seamlessly into the landscape, their dome shapes echoing the curves of the surrounding hills. Smoke rose from carefully tended fires, creating a haze that softened the edges of everything and gave the entire scene a dreamlike quality. Children played along the stream banks, their laughter carrying across the water like music. Women worked outside the lodges, preparing food and crafting tools with the unhurried efficiency of people who had found their proper place in the world. Men tended horses in corrals built from native stone, the animals sleek and well cared for, despite the remote location. This was not a desperate refugee camp, but a thriving community that had chosen isolation over assimilation. The arrival of Black Wolf and his unexpected companions did not go unnoticed. Warriors materialized from concealed positions with the silent efficiency of people trained from childhood in the arts of war and survival. They wore traditional dress mixed with practical items taken from white settlements. Buckskin leggings, paired with woolen shirts, traditional war paint combined with modern rifles. Eleanor felt their eyes upon her with the weight of judgment, but saw no immediate hostility in their expressions. An elderly woman emerged from the largest lodge, her grey hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light. Despite her age, she moved with the upright bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. Her dark eyes fixed on Eleanor with penetrating intelligence, taking in every detail of the white woman's appearance and condition before settling. On the baby sleeping against her chest, Black Wolf spoke to the woman in rapid Modoc, his tone respectful but urgent. Eleanor caught only fragments of meaning from his gestures and expressions, but it was clear he was explaining their circumstances and requesting sanctuary for the refugees he had brought to the hidden valley. The woman listened without interruption, her weathered face revealing nothing of her thoughts. When Black Wolf finished his explanation, the elderly woman approached Eleanor directly, her steps measured and deliberate. She spoke in accented but clear English, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Winona, mother of the war chief, keeper of the winter camp. Black Wolf tells me you were cast out by your own people for refusing to submit to a cruel marriage. Is this true?" Eleanor met the woman's gaze directly, sensing that any attempt at deception or manipulation would be immediately detected and harshly judged. "Yes," she said simply. "I chose poverty and exile over marriage to a man who would have beaten me and corrupted my son. My people considered this rebellion rather than courage." Winona nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected about white society. "Among our people, a woman who shows such strength would be honored, not punished. Children are gifts from the spirits, not property to be traded for material advantage." She reached out to touch Samuel's tiny hand, her expression softening as the baby grasped her finger with surprising strength. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "You may stay," Winona declared, her words carrying the finality of law. "You will work as all work, contribute as you can, learn our ways if you choose. In return, you will have protection, food, shelter, and the chance to raise your child among people who value courage over compliance." She turned to address the gathered villagers in Modoc, her voice carrying across the camp with unmistakable authority. The crowd dispersed with the efficiency of people accustomed to following orders without question. Eleanor found herself assigned to a small lodge near the stream, its interior furnished with buffalo robes and traditional furnishings that spoke of craftsmanship passed down through generations. A young woman named Ayana introduced herself as Eleanor's guide and teacher, appointed to help the white refugee adapt to Modoc customs and expectations. Ayana was perhaps 20 years old, with the quiet confidence of someone raised in the traditional ways, but educated enough to serve as translator between cultures. She spoke excellent English mixed with fragments of Spanish and French, evidence of contact with traders and missionaries that had shaped her broader understanding of the world beyond the Hidden Valley. "The first thing you must understand," Ayana explained as she helped Eleanor settle into her new quarters, "is that everything here belongs to everyone. Personal property exists, but the welfare of the community comes before individual desires. You will eat what others eat, work when others work, rest when the day's tasks are completed. No one goes hungry while others feast, and no one is idle. While others labor." Eleanor found this concept both liberating and challenging after a lifetime of rigid social hierarchies and individual accumulation of wealth. The idea that her worth would be measured by contribution rather than possession, by character rather than marriage prospects, offered a kind of freedom she had never imagined possible. As evening fell over the Hidden Valley, Eleanor joined the communal dinner around a great fire that served as the heart of the camp. The food was unlike anything she had ever tasted: roasted venison seasoned with mountain herbs, wild rice mixed with berries and nuts, bread made from acorn flour that had been processed according to ancient techniques. Every bite carried flavors that seemed to connect her directly to the land itself. The conversation around the fire flowed between English and Modoc, depending on the speaker and subject, creating a linguistic tapestry that reflected the complex cultural situation of a people caught between traditional ways and an encroaching modern world. Eleanor listened with growing fascination as stories were shared, plans discussed, and news exchanged about the outside world that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant. Black Wolf sat across the fire from her, his war paint washed away, to reveal a face that was younger and more vulnerable than she had expected. Without the fierce mask of the warrior, he looked like what he was, a man in his 30s who had seen too much death and carried too many responsibilities for someone his age. When their eyes met across the flames, Eleanor felt something stir that she had thought died with her husband. After the meal, as the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, Eleanor found herself sitting beside the stream with Samuel in her arms, while Ayana pointed out constellations that carried different meanings in Modoc cosmology than in the astronomy she had learned in school. The stars seemed brighter here, more present and immediate, as if the absence of artificial light allowed them to reclaim their proper role as guides and teachers. "You will like it here," Ayana said with quiet confidence. "The mountain spirits have a way of healing those who come with open hearts and wounded souls. You and your child will grow strong in this place and perhaps find peace that the white world could never offer you." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, as if she could see futures hidden from normal sight. Eleanor felt the truth of those words settling into her bones like warmth from a long-awaited fire. For the first time since her husband's death, she began to believe that she and Samuel might not merely survive, but truly thrive, might find in this hidden valley something approaching the happiness that had been stolen from them by the cruelty and narrow-mindedness of civilization. As she prepared for sleep in her new lodge, listening to the gentle sounds of the camp settling into night routine, Eleanor reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 48 hours ago, she had been facing death. In a boar's den, abandoned by her own people and left to die like an unwanted animal. Now she was part of a community that valued her courage, protected her independence, and offered her son a chance to grow up among people who would judge him by his character rather than the circumstances of his birth. Black Wolf appeared in the doorway of her lodge as she was arranging Samuel's sleeping robes, his presence filling the small space with quiet intensity. "The council meets tomorrow," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "They will vote on whether to allow you permanent sanctuary or send you back to the white settlements when spring comes. Tonight was just hospitality. Tomorrow determines your fate." Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized that her acceptance into the community was not as settled as she had believed. "What will determine their decision?" she asked, trying to keep fear from her voice. "What do I need to do to prove my worth to them?" Black Wolf's expression was unreadable in the dim light filtering through the lodge walls. "Be yourself," he said simply. "Show them the courage that brought you this far. The council values truth above all else. They will see through any attempt at deception or false humility. Your best chance is to trust in the strength that kept you alive when others would have broken." As the warrior disappeared back into the night, Eleanor held Samuel close and tried to calm her racing thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and character, but tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was warm, fed, and surrounded by people who saw her as something other than a burden or a temptation. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through exile and abandonment. The hidden valley settled into silence around her, protected by stone walls and ancient magic from the harsh realities of the outside world. Eleanor drifted towards sleep, listening to the sound of water flowing over rocks, carrying with it the whispered promises of a new life that might finally offer the peace and belonging she had sought across half a continent. Dawn broke over the hidden valley with the slow majesty of ceremony, painting the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, while mist rose from the stream like the breath of sleeping spirits. Eleanor woke to the sound of drums beating a complex rhythm that seemed to echo from the stone walls themselves, calling the community together for the council meeting that would determine her fate. Samuel stirred against her chest, his small face peaceful in sleep despite the momentous day ahead. Ayana appeared at the lodge entrance, carrying traditional clothing woven from mountain sheep wool and decorated with intricate beadwork, that told stories in patterns passed down through generations. "You must dress properly for the council," she explained, her voice carrying an urgency that made Eleanor's stomach clench with anxiety. "The elders judge not only words, but also respect for our customs. How you present yourself will speak before you ever open your mouth." The garments felt strange against Eleanor's skin, heavier and more substantial than her worn cotton dress, but also somehow more protective, as if the wool itself carried the strength of the animals that had given their lives for its creation. The beadwork seemed to shift and flow in the morning light, creating patterns that appeared different from every angle. Symbols that spoke of earth and sky, water and fire, the eternal cycles that governed all life in the mountains. As Eleanor made her way toward the council circle, she noticed the entire camp had undergone a transformation overnight. Warriors who had appeared friendly the evening before now watched her with the cold assessment of judges evaluating a potential threat. Women who had shared food and conversation around the fire now whispered among themselves, their voices carrying undercurrents of debate and disagreement. Even the children seemed subdued, as if they understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The council circle itself occupied a natural amphitheater carved into the living rock by centuries of water and wind, its walls decorated with pictographs that recorded the history of the Modoc people in images that stretched back to the beginning of memory. 12 elders sat in positions of honor, their faces painted with symbols of their particular responsibilities and spiritual authority. At the center of the circle, a fire burned with wood from 7 different sacred trees, its smoke rising straight up into the still morning air like a prayer made visible. Winona gestured for Eleanor to take a position in the center of the circle, directly facing the council, while the rest of the community arranged itself on the surrounding stone benches carved by ancient hands. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on her like a physical force, dozens of pairs of eyes examining every detail of her appearance and demeanor for signs of weakness or deception. Black Wolf took his place among the warriors, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes meeting hers briefly with what might have been encouragement or warning. Eleanor noticed that he wore full war regalia for the first time since she had known him, his chest bare except for the scars that marked his battles and the sacred symbols painted in white clay that identified his clan and status within the tribe. The eldest member of the council rose to his feet with the careful dignity of great age, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed 8 decades of change and upheaval in the mountain country. "I am Takoda, keeper of the old ways, speaker for those who have passed beyond the veil. We gather in sacred circle to judge the petition of this white woman who seeks sanctuary among the people. Let all who have words to speak do so with truth, for lies spoken in this place will follow the speaker beyond death itself." Eleanor felt the formal weight of the moment settle around her like a cloak, understanding that this was not merely a practical discussion about resources and security, but a spiritual ceremony that would bind all participants to whatever decision emerged from their deliberations. The very air seemed to thicken with significance, charged with the accumulated power of countless previous councils that had shaped the destiny of the Modoc people. A middle-aged warrior named Chaitan stood to address the circle, his voice carrying the hard edge of someone who had fought too many battles against impossible odds. "This woman brings danger to our sanctuary," he declared, his words falling like stones into still water. "Her people will search for her, and their search will lead them to us. We have remained hidden for 3 generations by taking no unnecessary risks. Why should we endanger our children for the sake of one white refugee?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, and Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized that significant opposition to her presence existed among the community. The practical arguments against harboring white fugitives were compelling. Discovery would mean destruction for the entire village, death or forced relocation for people who had found peace in their mountain sanctuary. Winona rose to respond, her voice carrying the authority of her position as keeper of the winter camp. Chaitin speaks from wisdom earned in battle, and his concerns deserve consideration. But we must also remember that our strength comes not from hiding alone, but from living according to the principles that make us Modoc. We do not abandon the helpless, we do not turn away from justice, and we do not allow fear to make cowards of us. Another elder, a woman named Casa, whose face bore the ritual scars of a medicine keeper, added her voice to the debate. The spirits sent this woman to us for a purpose we may not yet understand. Black Wolf found her in the moment of greatest danger, guided by forces beyond mere chance. To reject such clear signs would invite the displeasure of powers greater than ourselves. Eleanor listened to the debate flow around her in a mixture of English and Modoc, understanding enough to follow the major arguments but missing the subtle nuances that carried equal weight in the council's deliberations. She could see the community dividing into factions, those who prioritized security against those who emphasized traditional values, pragmatists against spiritualists, warriors against medicine keepers. Black Wolf finally rose to speak, his presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the circle. I brought this woman here because I saw in her the courage our people honor above all other virtues. She chose exile and possible death rather than submit to abuse and degradation. Her own people cast her out for refusing to betray her principles. How can we punish her for showing the same strength we demand from our own children? The warrior's words carried special weight because of his reputation and standing within the community, but Eleanor could see they had not settled the debate. Chaitin stood again, his expression grim with the knowledge of military realities. Courage is admirable, but it does not change the fact that cavalry patrols have increased along our borders. The white government grows more aggressive each season, more determined to force all native peoples onto reservations. This woman's presence gives them additional excuse to violate our territory. Takoda raised his hand for silence, the gesture carrying enough authority to quiet even the most passionate speakers. We have heard arguments for welcome and arguments for rejection. Now we must hear from the woman herself. Eleanor Crawford, daughter of the White Nation, mother of the child Samuel, speak truth to this council about your intentions and your heart. Eleanor stood slowly, feeling the weight of Samuel in her arms and the collective gaze of the community upon her. Everything depended on the next few minutes, whether she and her son would find sanctuary among people who understood courage or be cast back into a world that had already rejected them once. Her voice, when she found it, was steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her words. Honored elders, respected warriors, mothers and fathers of this community, I stand before you not as a representative of my people, but as someone they have abandoned. I do not ask you to trust the white race or make peace with those who threaten your way of life. I ask only that you judge me by my actions rather than my ancestry, by my character rather than my color. She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage before continuing. Your scout Black Wolf saved my life, and that of my child when my own people left us to die like animals. He showed us mercy when we deserved nothing, kindness when we had no claim to it. I cannot promise that my presence will bring no danger, but I can swear that I will die before I betray the trust you show me. Eleanor shifted Samuel in her arms, the baby's presence reminding her of what was truly at stake. My son will grow up to know that courage comes in many colors, that honor exists in many cultures, and that the truest strength lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. If you grant us sanctuary, he will learn your ways and honor your traditions. If you send us away, I will carry the memory of your kindness to whatever end awaits us." The council fell silent as Eleanor's words echoed off the stone walls. Her simple honesty cutting through the complex political and practical considerations that had dominated the debate. Even Chayton seemed moved by her directness, though his expression remained troubled by the security implications of harboring white refugees. Winona spoke into the silence, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "The council will now deliberate in private. Eleanor Crawford and her child will wait by the sacred spring while we reach our decision. Black Wolf will stand guard to ensure no harm comes to them during our discussions." As Eleanor was led away from the council circle, she caught glimpses of the intense discussions that erupted as soon as she was out of earshot. Gestures flew between speakers, voices rose in passionate argument, and she could see the community struggling with a decision that would affect not only her future, but potentially their own survival. The sacred spring, where she waited with Black Wolf, occupied a grotto carved from living rock, its walls decorated with ancient symbols that seemed to watch the proceedings with timeless patience. Water bubbled up from deep within the earth, so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. Eleanor knelt beside the pool, seeing her reflection wavering in the constantly moving surface. "Whatever they decide," Black Wolf said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of flowing water, "know that you have shown them something they needed to see. Your courage reminds us what we fight to preserve, what makes life worth living, even in the face of overwhelming odds." Eleanor looked at this man who had saved her life and brought her to sanctuary, who had risked his own standing within the community for the sake of strangers who meant nothing to his people. "Why did you help us?" she asked, the question that had been growing in her mind since their first meeting. "What did you see in us that was worth such risk?" Black Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the spring as if seeking answers in its depths. "I saw my sister," he said finally. "I saw my nephew who died in the snow. I saw all the innocents who have suffered while good people did nothing because actions seemed too dangerous or difficult. Sometimes the greatest courage lies not in winning battles, but in refusing to let the world turn you into something you cannot live with being." The sound of drums from the council circle interrupted their conversation, the complex rhythms signaling that a decision had been reached. Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as they made their way back to face whatever judgment the elders had rendered. Takoda stood in the center of the circle, his ancient face revealing nothing of the council's deliberations. "Eleanor Crawford," he began, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with ceremonial gravity. "We have reached our decision through long debate and careful consideration of all arguments. You will remain among us through the winter season as a guest under our protection. When spring returns and the pass is open, you will choose your own path, to stay permanently among the Modoc people or return to the white world with our blessing. And safe passage?" Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the community's judgment sank in. Not permanent acceptance, but the gift of time. Months to prove her worth, to demonstrate her commitment, to earn the trust that would allow her and Samuel to build a new life among people who understood the true meaning of courage. As the council dispersed, and normal life resumed in the hidden valley, Eleanor understood that she had been granted something more precious than gold, the opportunity to become someone new, to raise her son among people who would judge him by his character rather than his circumstances, to find in this mountain sanctuary the peace and belonging that had been denied them by the civilized world below. 3 months into winter, the hidden valley transformed into a crystalline fortress of ice and snow that sparkled like diamonds under the harsh mountain sun. Eleanor had learned to move through the deep drifts with the snowshoes Ayana taught her to weave from willow branches and rawhide, her breath forming white clouds in air so cold it burned her lungs with every inhalation. Samuel, now 7 months old and thriving on a diet of elk milk and mountain herbs, had grown strong and alert in the clean mountain air, his eyes bright with intelligence as he watched the world from his cradleboard carved by Black Wolf's own hands. The rhythms of winter life in the Modoc camp had become second nature to Eleanor, each day beginning before dawn with the feeding of fires that meant the difference between life and death in temperatures that could freeze blood in a man's veins. She had learned to tan hides with a mixture of brain matter and pine ash, to preserve meat in the traditional way that kept it fresh for months, to weave baskets tight enough to hold water and strong enough to carry a full day's gathering of roots and berries. But it was her growing skill as a healer that truly earned respect among the Modoc people. Working beside Casa, the medicine keeper, Eleanor discovered that her intuitive understanding of human suffering translated perfectly to the ancient arts of mountain healing. She learned which plants eased the pain of childbirth, which combinations of herbs could break a fever that threatened a child's life, which songs and ceremonies helped wounded warriors find peace in their recovery. The crisis that would test everything she had learned came on a night when the wind howled down from the peaks like the voices of angry spirits, carrying with it snow so thick it turned the world into a white void where a man could lose his way between lodge and fire pit. Eleanor woke to frantic pounding on her door and Ayana's voice cutting through the storm with desperate urgency that sent ice water through her veins. "Come quickly," Ayana gasped, her face twisted with fear and exhaustion. "Little Fox has been hurt badly. A tree fell during the storm, crushed his leg and trapped him for hours in the cold. Casa is with the war chief's wife, who labors with a difficult birth. You are the only healer available, and the boy is dying." Eleanor bundled Samuel against the storm and followed Ayana through drifts that reached above her waist, fighting against wind that tried to tear the breath from her lungs and snow that stung her exposed skin like needles of ice. The lodge where little Fox lay was filled with the smell of blood and fear, his parents hovering helplessly while their 12-year-old son writhed in agony on a bed of buffalo robes. The injury was worse than Eleanor had feared. The falling. Pine had shattered the boy's right leg below the knee, driving bone fragments through muscle and skin, while crushing blood vessels that painted the snow crimson during his rescue. Worse, the hours spent trapped in the freezing cold had turned his extremities blue-black with frostbite that threatened to spread up his limbs like poison. Eleanor knelt beside the injured child, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, as she assessed the damage while fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her medical judgment. This was beyond anything she had treated before, a case that would challenge an experienced surgeon in a fully equipped hospital, yet she was the only hope this family had in a storm that made travel impossible even if help existed elsewhere. "Bring me willow bark tea for the pain," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "Heat water to boiling and gather all the clean cloth in the camp. Send someone to Black Wolf's lodge for the bone needles he uses to repair weapons, and find me the sharpest knife in the village." The family moved with desperate urgency, eager to help but careful not to interfere with her work. What followed was the longest night of Eleanor's life, a battle fought with primitive tools and ancient knowledge against injuries that would have challenged modern medicine. She cleaned and set the broken bones using techniques Casa had taught her, stitched torn flesh with sinew and skill learned through countless smaller emergencies, and fought the advancing frostbite with warming treatments that risked further damage if applied incorrectly. Little Fox drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the procedure, his small body racked with pain, despite the willowbark tea and mountain herbs Eleanor used to ease his suffering. She worked by the light of pine torches that cast dancing shadows on the lodge walls, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting and the knowledge that failure meant watching a child die. By dawn, when the storm finally exhausted itself and pale sunlight began filtering through the smoke hole, Eleanor had done everything her knowledge and skill could accomplish. Little Fox's leg was set and splintered, his wounds cleaned and bandaged, his frostbite treated with warming poultices that showed promising signs of recovery. Whether he would walk again remained uncertain, but he would live. The news of her success spread through the camp like wildfire, carried by whispers that grew into stories that would be told around winter fires for generations to come. The white woman who had been cast out by her own people had saved a Modoc child using medicine that blended the knowledge of two worlds, proving that healing knew no boundaries of race or culture. Black Wolf appeared at her lodge that evening as she sat exhausted by her fire, Samuel sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the drama that had consumed the day. The warrior's face showed an emotion she had never seen there before, something deeper than respect, more personal than admiration. "You have earned something today that cannot be given or taken away," he said, settling beside her fire with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in her presence. "You have proven that courage takes many forms, that the will to heal can be as powerful as the will to fight. The council will not need to debate your fate when spring comes." Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her chest as she realized the full meaning of his words. "You mean they'll let us stay permanently?" she asked, hardly daring to believe that the sanctuary she had dreamed of might actually be within reach. Black Wolf nodded, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he watched her face. "More than that, they will offer you full membership in the tribe, the right to call yourself Modoc, to raise your son as one of our own. It is an honor rarely granted to outsiders, a recognition that you have proven yourself worthy of our trust and respect." The magnitude of what he was telling her struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Full membership in the tribe meant more than just safety and belonging. It meant the complete transformation of her identity, the chance to become someone entirely new while leaving behind the woman who had been rejected and abandoned by white society. But even as joy flooded through her at the prospect of permanent sanctuary, Eleanor felt a shadow of uncertainty about what such a transformation would mean for Samuel. "What about my son?" she asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in her mind throughout the winter. "He's still young enough to adapt completely to Modoc ways, but should he be denied knowledge of his white heritage entirely?" Black Wolf considered her question with the serious attention it deserved, understanding that the choice she made would shape not only her own future, but that of the next generation. "Among our people, children learn the stories of all their ancestors, the wisdom of every culture that flows in their blood. Samuel will know he is the son of a brave woman who chose honor over comfort, that his white grandfather was a good man who died too young, that his Modoc family values courage above all other virtues." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized that Black Wolf was offering something she had never dared hope for, the chance for Samuel to grow up whole, connected to both sides of his heritage without shame or apology. In the white world, he would always be marked as illegitimate, tainted by circumstances beyond his control. Among the Modoc, he could simply be himself. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside the lodge, voices raised in excitement, and alarm that sent both Eleanor and Black Wolf reaching for weapons before they recognized the tone as celebration rather than warning. Ayana burst through the entrance, her face bright with joy and relief. "Little Fox is walking," she announced, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to share the miraculous news. "He woke an hour ago and insisted on trying to stand. The leg holds his weight, and though he limps, he moves without help. Casa says it is the finest healing she has witnessed in 40 years of medicine work." Eleanor felt her heart soar as she realized that her desperate gamble had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes. Not only had she saved the boy's life, but she had preserved his mobility, given him back the chance to run and hunt and live as a complete person rather than a crippled invalid dependent on others for survival. Word of little Fox's recovery brought visitors to Eleanor's lodge throughout the evening. Warriors who nodded with respect, mothers who brought gifts of their finest crafts, elders who spoke in formal tones about the debt the tribe owed to her skill and dedication. Even Chaitan, the warrior who had opposed her acceptance into the community, came to offer his acknowledgement of her worth. "I spoke against you in council," he said with the direct honesty that Modoc culture valued above politeness. "I believed your presence would bring danger without sufficient benefit to justify the risk. I was wrong. You have given us back one of our children, healed wounds that seemed beyond repair. For this, you have my respect and my protection." As winter deepened, toward its harshest months, Eleanor found herself becoming increasingly integrated into the social fabric of the Modoc community. She participated in the storytelling circles where tribal history was preserved and passed on, contributed her own tales of the white world that helped the younger generation understand the complexities of the changing times, and gradually developed relationships that went beyond mere acceptance to genuine friendship. Her bond with Black Wolf deepened throughout the long winter nights as they shared watches over the camp's security, talked about their different cultures' approaches to raising children, and found in each other's company a peace that neither had experienced since losing their first families to violence and tragedy. What grew between them was not the desperate passion of lonely people seeking comfort, but the deeper connection of souls who had found their match in courage and character. When the blizzards finally began to break, and the first signs of spring appeared in the lengthening days and the return of birdsong to the mountain peaks, Eleanor realized that she had found something in the hidden valley that went beyond mere survival. She had discovered her true self, the woman she was meant to be, when freed from the constraints and expectations of a society that valued compliance over courage. The formal ceremony of adoption into the tribe was scheduled for the spring equinox, when the balance between light and darkness symbolized the harmony Eleanor had brought to the community. But even before the official recognition, she knew in her heart that she had already made the transformation from refugee to tribal member, from outsider to someone who belonged. Samuel, now walking with the confident steps of a child raised in love and security, showed no signs of the trauma that had marked his early months. He babbled in a mixture of English and Modoc, played with the other children without awareness of racial boundaries, and seemed destined to grow up as a bridge between worlds rather than a victim of their conflicts. As Eleanor watched her son take his first independent steps across the lodge floor, reaching toward Black Wolf's outstretched hands with complete trust and joy, she understood that the journey that had begun with abandonment and exile had led to something far more valuable than the life she had lost. She had found not just safety, but belonging, not just survival, but purpose, not just acceptance, but love. The woman who had been thrown away like garbage by her own people had become a healer whose skills were treasured by an entire community. A mother whose child would grow up knowing his worth was measured by his character rather than his circumstances. And perhaps, if the growing warmth in Black Wolf's eyes meant what she hoped it did, a partner who could build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Spring came to the mountains with the violence of avalanches and the fury of rivers swollen beyond their banks, washing away the last barriers between the hidden valley and the outside world that Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. The snow, melted in torrents that turned peaceful streams into raging torrents, carrying with them the detritus of winter and the promise of change that would test everything the Modoc people had built in their mountain sanctuary. Eleanor stood at the edge of the valley watching the transformation, Samuel strapped to her back in the traditional cradleboard that marked him as a child of two worlds. At 10 months old, he had grown strong and curious, his eyes bright with intelligence as he pointed at eagles soaring overhead and babbled questions in the mixture of languages that had become his natural tongue. The first sign came from the scouts who maintained watch on the hidden passes. Ayana brought the news to Eleanor as she worked in the medicine lodge, grinding willow bark into powder for the pain remedies that had become her specialty. "Riders approaching from the south," Ayana reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. 30 men, maybe more, moving in formation like soldiers but wearing civilian clothes. They carry the kind of weapons used for hunting men, not animals, and they ask questions in every settlement about a white woman and child who disappeared. Last autumn, Eleanor felt ice water flood her veins as she realized the implications. Only one man in her experience combined such wealth with such vindictive persistence. "Marcus Blackwood," she whispered, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. "He's found us somehow, tracked us all this way. He won't give up until he either claims me or destroys everything in his path trying." Word of the approaching threat spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire, bringing warriors running from their daily tasks and sending mothers gathering their children closer to the safety of the central lodges. Within minutes, the peaceful community had transformed into a military camp preparing for siege. Black Wolf emerged from the War Council lodge wearing full battle regalia, his face painted with the red and black stripes that marked him as a war leader ready to defend his people to the death. His eyes found Eleanor across the busy camp, and she saw in them the cold calculation of a warrior who had already accepted that blood would flow before the sun set. 30 armed men is too many to fight directly, he reported to the assembled families. But they do not know our territory, and they move like white soldiers who expect enemies to stand and fight rather than disappear like smoke when attacked. Eleanor felt the weight of collective judgment as dozens of eyes turned toward her, the unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke from a signal fire. These people had given her sanctuary, and now her presence threatened everything they had worked to protect. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the debate with surprising strength. "I won't be the reason you lose your home, and I won't run anymore. If Marcus Blackwood wants me, he can face me directly instead of threatening innocent people who showed me kindness when my own kind cast me out." Black Wolf's expression shifted from military calculation to something far more personal and dangerous. "You speak of facing him directly, as if you plan to surrender yourself to save us. That is not the Modoc way, and it is not acceptable to me as someone who has sworn to protect you." Eleanor met his gaze across the circle, seeing the depth of feeling he rarely allowed himself to express in public. Over the long winter months, what had begun as mutual respect had deepened into something that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. "Then we fight," she said, her words carrying the finality of a war declaration. "But we fight smart, using every advantage this mountain gives us. I know Marcus Blackwood's weaknesses, his arrogance, and his need to dominate everything he touches." The war council that followed lasted through the afternoon, as Eleanor shared everything she knew about Marcus's methods, while Black Wolf and the other warriors developed a battle plan that would use the valley's natural defenses to maximum advantage. The narrow passes that protected the hidden sanctuary could also become killing grounds for enemies foolish enough to enter without understanding the terrain. As evening approached, the scouts reported that the search party had made camp at the base of the rock maze, apparently planning to begin their assault at first light. Eleanor could picture Marcus studying maps by firelight, plotting his approach with the same cold calculation he had once used to steal her husband's land. The attack came at dawn, just as the War Council had predicted, with Marcus leading. His hired gunmen threw the maze in a column formation that showed their complete ignorance of mountain warfare. Eleanor watched from her position on the canyon rim as the armed men struggled through passages designed to confuse and disorient invaders. Black Wolf had positioned his warriors with the patience of a master hunter, each man hidden among the rocks with clear fields of fire and predetermined escape routes. The first shots came from multiple directions simultaneously, sending echoes bouncing off the canyon walls until it sounded like an entire army was firing. 3 of Marcus's men fell in the opening volley, their bodies tumbling from horseback, to lie motionless on the rocky ground, while their companions scrambled for cover among the stone pillars. The attack had the desired effect of sowing confusion and panic among men who expected to be hunting defenseless refugees rather than fighting seasoned warriors on their home ground. The fighting continued through the morning as Marcus's force tried repeatedly to break through the maze, only to be turned back by precisely placed rifle fire and strategically triggered rock slides. By noon, half his men were dead or wounded, and the remainder showed clear signs of losing their stomach for a fight that had cost them far more than they had bargained for. It was then that Marcus made the mistake Eleanor had been waiting for. Instead of ordering a retreat that would have saved the lives of his remaining men, he demanded they continue the assault regardless of casualties, driven by the same arrogance that had made him believe he could claim any woman he desired through intimidation and violence. Eleanor recognized the moment when Marcus's tactical judgment gave way to personal obsession. She signaled to Black Wolf that the time had come for the final phase of their plan, the trap that would require her to expose herself to danger, but would give them the chance to capture the man who had orchestrated her exile. Black Wolf moved through the rocks like a shadow given deadly purpose, working his way behind Marcus's position while the remaining defenders kept the gunmen pinned down. Eleanor began her descent into the maze, following a path known only to the Modoc that would bring her face to face with the man who had haunted her nightmares. She found Marcus crouched behind a boulder, his fine clothes torn and stained with dust and blood, his face twisted with the rage of a man who could not accept that his will might be thwarted by those he considered inferior. When he saw her approaching, his expression shifted from fury to triumph. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice carrying the same false charm he had used during their confrontation at the wagon train. "You've led me quite a chase, but it's time to end this foolishness. Come with me now, and I'll spare the lives of your savage friends." Eleanor stepped into the open space between them, Samuel secure on her back and her hand resting on the bone knife Black Wolf had given her for protection. "You're in no position to make demands, Marcus. If your men are dead and the other half are ready to run, you should have stayed in Oregon where people were afraid of you." Marcus's face darkened with the kind of rage that had driven him to organize this expedition in the first place. "You think these animals can protect you from civilization? You think hiding in the mountains changes what you are, a woman who needs a man's guidance and protection?" The sound of a rifle being cocked behind Marcus's position announced Black Wolf's arrival, the war leader emerging from concealment with his weapon trained on the would-be captor. "The only animal I see is the one who abandons women and children to die in the wilderness because his pride was wounded by honest rejection." Marcus spun toward the new threat, his hand dropping to his pistol in a move that sealed his fate. Black Wolf's rifle spoke with the voice of final judgment, the bullet taking Marcus center mass and dropping him to the rocky ground where he would never rise again. The man who had pursued Eleanor across half a continent for the crime of choosing freedom over submission breathed his last in the mountain wilderness he had violated with his presence. The surviving members of the search party, leaderless and demoralized, accepted the terms of surrender that allowed them to depart, with their lives in exchange for spreading word that the mountains held dangers no amount of money could overcome. In the aftermath of the battle, as the community worked to treat the wounded and honor the dead, Eleanor found herself standing once again at the edge of the hidden valley with Samuel in her arms. But this time she felt no uncertainty about her place in the world, no doubt about where she belonged or what her future might hold. Black Wolf approached her as the sun set over the peaks they had successfully defended, his war paint washed away to reveal the face of the man she had come to love through the long winter nights and the crucible of shared danger. "It's finished," he said simply. "No one will come looking for you now. You're free to be whoever you choose to be." Eleanor turned to face the warrior who had saved her life and helped her find her true strength. "I choose to be Eleanor Crawford Black Wolf," she said, using the name that honored both her heritage and her future. Mother to Samuel, healer to the Modoc people, and partner to the bravest man I've ever known. As they walked back toward the lodges where their new life waited, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from exile and abandonment to belonging and purpose. She'd been thrown away by her own people like refuse in a boar's den, left to die for the crime of choosing dignity over degradation. But the mountains had given her something far more valuable than the life she had lost. They had given her the chance to become the woman she was always meant to be. The hidden valley settled into evening around them, protected by stone walls and warriors' courage from a world that still held too much cruelty and too little justice. But within those walls, Eleanor had found her sanctuary at last, a place where courage was honored over compliance, where children could grow up whole regardless of the circumstances of their birth, and where love could flourish between hearts that recognized their match in strength and character. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.